review videos for every movie I watch because that would be excessive. But one of my favorite films of the year came and went and I never made a video about it and it feels wrong. And in my defense, it was released when I was trying to cover 4 overlapping film festivals at once, so I really didn't have time. But I can't stop thinking about this movie. So instead of doing a regular review video, I'm going to talk about why I think Richard Linklater's Blue Moon is life-changing. But before I dive in, I just want to put this into perspective. I use the words captivating and mesmerizing a lot when I talk about movies, but those words feel like an understatement when I try to explain what this movie did to me. So for context, I saw this movie in a theater that couldn't have had more than 10 people in it, and there was one group of people that wouldn't stop talking and using their phones. I don't think they even knew what movie they walked into, because when the title appeared on screen, they said the title out loud, which is just a bizarre thing to do in my opinion. Someone else in the audience asked them to be quiet, and they were, for about 1 minute. And a couple months prior to this, I witnessed someone get threatened for asking noisy people to be quiet, so I didn't really want to do that. So I moved to a seat that was as far away from them as possible, but I could still hear them, so I put earplugs in. I always carry concert earplugs on me, and I'd like to think that they help block out the noise of other moviegoers while still allowing me to hear the movie. But of course, I could still hear these people, and one of the kids in that group kept walking in and out of the theater for some inexplicable reason. He must have walked past me at least 8 times. Needless to say, these people were very disruptive. Fast forward to the end of the movie, and I get up to leave and realize those people were gone. They left at some point during the movie, and I didn't even notice because this movie basically put me into a trance. I was just so engrossed in this movie that I became completely unaware of my surroundings. And the fact that a movie that takes place almost entirely in a single setting over the course of one evening with only a handful of characters was capable of doing that to me is so impressive, because this movie is so dialogue driven. If this was a fantasy or an action film, then I could understand someone getting so absorbed into the movie that everything else fades out. But for a movie like this to pull that off, that's a pretty big accomplishment. And for those who don't know, this movie is about Loren's Hart, someone I previously had no interest in. So again, the spell this movie had over me should be studied. And I'm a huge fan of Richard Linklater, especially his writing, but he didn't even write this screenplay. Normally when I do a movies that change my life video, there's a spoiler warning because I walk through the entire plot. But I won't do that this time because I can explain why it was life-changing for me without discussing every single plot point. Also, there really isn't anything that can be spoiled about this movie. It's not the type of film where you can read a plot synopsis and be like, oh, I already know everything that happens. It's just something you have to experience. But Blue Moon opens with 2 quotes that set the tone and sum it up perfectly. The first quote reads, "He was alert and dynamic and fun to be around," followed by the quote, "He was the saddest man I ever knew." Those first few seconds grabbed me more than so many of the films I saw this year. It says so much with just 2 sentences. I've always been fascinated by the way people have so many different sides to them, sides that not everyone gets to see. For example, when someone takes their own life and people are shocked because they were always so cheerful and funny, it shows how not everyone can sense the pain a person is going through, and how even the people who seem the happiest can be hurting and so few people will realize it. But that's just an unrelated example. That's not how Loren's Hart passed away. In fact, Blue Moon reveals how he dies in the very first scene. We see him walking down an alleyway in the rain, singing to himself before he slumps over and lies on the ground. And we hear a radio announcement about him passing away from complications from pneumonia at the age of 48. So right from the start, you know he's going to die. That's not a spoiler. And I'm not always a fan of movies revealing that a character dies in the opening scene, but I think it works here because his death isn't what the film is about. And the radio announcement gives us all the details without shoehorning it into the dialogue, because it also explains how for over 20 years he worked with Richard Rodgers, with Rodgers writing the music and Hart writing the lyrics for a bunch of hit musicals. And there's this juxtaposition of this man lying on the ground on the verge of death all alone, while the announcement talks about his legendary career and partnership. So right away I thought this film was making a profound statement about fame and loneliness. Then it cuts to 7 months earlier on March 31st, 1943, as Hart is watching the opening night of Oklahoma. He walks out and goes to the restaurant where the opening night celebration is scheduled to take place. But of course, since he walked out of the musical early, he's the first guest to arrive. He and the bartender agree that the best line in Casablanca is "Nobody ever loved me that much," and he reflects on how no one has ever been loved even half enough. Hearing him say that shortly after the opening scene is something that really spoke to me, because something that deeply upsets me is when someone didn't feel loved or appreciated while they were alive, and then after they pass away, suddenly everyone has so many nice things to say about them, especially when it's an artist who didn't feel appreciated or celebrated during their lifetime, but we're still talking about their work all these years later. For example, I'm not a Doctor Who person, but I watched that one episode with Vincent van Gogh because I stumbled upon a clip from it one day where they bring him to the future and he gets to see the legacy he had, and I was really moved by it. I just think it's so important to let people know that what they do matters while they're still here, and to let people know how much they mean to you before it's too late. One of my friends passed away about 5 years ago, and we weren't super close. We both moved around a lot, so we just stayed in touch online. And I'm so grateful that during our last conversation, which I had no idea would be our last conversation, I told him he was one of the nicest people I've ever met and how his kindness had a huge impact on my life. And I feel like Lorenz Hart is one of those people who didn't feel loved enough while he was here. I mean, people are more familiar with the names Rodgers and Hammerstein than they are Rodgers and Hart. This movie almost feels like Linklater's Amadeus in its portrayal of a lesser-known artist overshadowed by a more celebrated colleague, but the jealousy is much more understated and quietly devastating. This is easily one of Ethan Hawke's best performances. He completely loses himself in this role. He's charming and arrogant on the surface, yet every line he delivers carries this subtle weight of regret and longing. His confident, joke-cracking demeanor is a facade, masking the sadness, nostalgia, envy, and regret lurking beneath. And even though this is a story that's so specific, there's something beautifully universal about it. We're watching this brilliant lyricist struggling not to be forgotten, forced to watch as his former partner receives praise and adoration for his collaboration with a new lyricist. So even though most of us aren't brilliant lyricists, many of us still know what it feels like to be replaced in some shape or form. How you want to be happy for this person for finding success, but you have to stifle the part of yourself that's bitter that they found it without you. Margaret Qualley is enchanting as Elizabeth, a 20-year-old university student who becomes the object of Hart's infatuation. Her poise and warmth are magnetic, commanding the audience's attention, so it's easy to see why Hart is so enraptured by her. And through this infatuation, the film acknowledges Hart's closeted homosexuality without reducing him to it. His affection for Elizabeth and his flirtation with a flower delivery boy reflect the contradictions going on inside him as he searches for connection in any form he can find. And the chemistry between Hawke and Qualley has this authentically ephemeral quality. The scenes they share together have this aching tension between fantasy and reality, between the love Hart so desperately wants and the love he's capable of receiving. Andrew Scott plays Richard Rodgers, and his screen time is brief, but his performance definitely makes an impression. You can tell just from the look in his eyes that this is a man who still cares about his former collaborator and is concerned for his well-being, but at the same time, he also seems relieved that he no longer has to have his work hindered by Hart's self-destructive tendencies. He acknowledges Hart's brilliance while also attempting to conceal his pity and suppress his frustrations. The technical aspects of Blue Moon are as thoughtfully composed as the performances. The film has this warm color palette that evokes both the glow of memory and the dim melancholy of regret, and the camera often lingers in medium shots, giving the film the feeling of a stage production. The editing is unobtrusive, so it feels as though the story is playing out in real time, and the score enhances the mood without dictating how the viewer should feel. All these elements work together to create an atmosphere that feels both nostalgic yet timeless. The screenplay is witty and thought-provoking, filled with meaningful musings on art, success, fame, sexuality, legacy, love, and loneliness. But there's one line in particular that really stood out to me, and it's the reason why I think this film is worth making one of these videos about. Because in one line, this film eloquently summed up something I've struggled to articulate for years. One of my favorite things about movies is how you can take away something different every time you watch them. The movie itself doesn't change, but you do, and so does your reaction to it. Coincidentally, this is also something I talked about in the Movies That Changed My Life video that I did about the Before trilogy. When you're young, Before Sunrise tends to be the film in that trilogy that resonates the most. And then as you get older, you start to see more of yourself in Before Sunset. And someone who may not have understood or enjoyed Before Midnight when it was released might revisit it years later and find that it now hits uncomfortably close to home. I love that there are movies I hated the first time I saw them that are now some of my all-time favorites. And it breaks my heart that movies I once loved no longer resonate with me the way that they used to. But there's something so beautiful and poetic about it. It's like when people talk about dating and use the phrase right person, wrong time. You can watch the right movie at the wrong time too. Only a movie isn't going to move on and date someone else. That movie will still be there when you need it. In Blue Moon, there's a scene where Hart tells Elizabeth she still has time, and he says, "That's the wonderful thing about art, isn't it? It waits for you." And maybe that line wasn't meant to hold that much significance. Maybe it was just meant to be taken at face value. You don't need to rush to to enjoy a piece of art because that art isn't going anywhere. So maybe I sound ridiculous, but those 4 words, art waits for you, just meant so much to me. Because a movie that might not work for you now could end up teaching you a lesson that you'll need later in life. And you might not appreciate it at the moment, but it'll be there when you need it, and hopefully you'll give it another chance and rediscover something special about it. And the same could be said about Blue Moon. I firmly believe this is one of the finest films in Linklater's filmography, but if you watch it and aren't a fan, maybe someday you'll revisit it and discover something new. Maybe you'll hyperfixate on one line and find meaning in it that quite possibly wasn't even intentional. Maybe you'll go through a breakup and seeing your ex move on with someone else will help you identify with Hart in ways you couldn't the first time you saw the film. I just think it's so important to keep an open mind and be willing to revisit some films even if you didn't love them the first time around, because each time it's a different experience and you never know what you're going to learn or gain when you experience a film again. Because movies are art, and after all, art waits for you.